Hello and welcome to Written in Uncertainty, an Elder Scrolls podcast that's firmly in the grey maybe of the series universe. My name is Aramithius, and today we're discussing one of the most fundamental divides on Mundus, a difference and a hatred that drove a primordial war. It's fueled conflict on Tamriel ever since, and it's led to a faction that, in the Fourth Era at the moment, quite a few fans have compared to the Nazis. Today we're asking, what is the man-Myrrh schism? And with a bit of a side helping of, do the Thalmor want to destroy the world? Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that this is my own understanding of the ideas involved and not necessarily the whole truth of the matters, although I'll do my best to bring in other viewpoints as well where they're appropriate. You may have some other ideas, and if so, I'd absolutely love to hear them. Please leave a comment on the blog post that accompanies this cast at writteninuncertainty.wordpress.com, and I'll also be linking the sources that I quote in that blog post. So please go through the sources and read them through rather than just taking what I say at face value. And please also join the conversation on the Written in Uncertainty Discord server. First of all, to understand what the difference is between man and Myrrh, we need to understand what they are to start with. Or at least what they're claiming to be. And that's the divide that fuels a lot of what will come later. The most usual understanding is that they were two different types of Elnathay at one point. You have the Elnathay arriving on Nirn in the Anuad narrative from elsewhere in the sense of one of the 12 worlds, not the Khajiit province. And the Elnathay are themselves the descendants of the gods who created Mundus. Although this narrative isn't entirely certain, the Elnathay get equated with the earth bones in the Atmora creation myth. From the monomyth, we have others, like Ifri, transform themselves into the Elnathay, the earth bones, so that the whole world might not die. Some had to marry and make children just to last. Each generation was weaker than the last, and soon there were Aldmer. Darkness caved in. Lorcan made armies out of the weakest souls and named them men, and they brought Sithis into every quarter. So the term Elnathay here is both the laws of physics and the things that hold Nirn together, as well as being the ancestors of the Aldmer. And you notice here that in this particular Myrrhish perspective, that Lorcan made an army out of souls, out of some of the weaker ones. The implication in that text feels like those souls almost aren't Elnathay. Or at least they're not wanting to think of them as being Elnathay, as not being the same thing. There's some sort of transformation that's happened in what Lorcan has done to them to make his army, which is, again, the fundamental difference here. The Myrrh claim descent from the gods, descent from the Elnathay, whereas the men choose, as the monomyth calls it, the more humble path in saying that they are created by the gods. And that difference is what informs a lot of what will come after, although it's a little confusing as to exactly what that difference is. As I've said already, they both come from the Elnathay in most of these narratives. So what's the difference here? Particularly if we look at the annotated Anuad, there's no sense of Lorcan making anything out of a certain type of Elnathay, or them being different in kind in any way. They're just different in what they did. The quote that makes this most clear is this. A large fragment of the Elnathay world landed on Nirn relatively intact, and the Elnathay living there were the ancestors of the Myrrh. These Elnathay fortified their borders from the chaos outside, hid their pocket of calm, and attempted to live on as before. Other Elnathay arrived on Nirn scattered amid the confused jumble of the shattered worlds, wandering and finding each other over the years. So, according to the Anuad narrative, the Elnathay from both Man and Myrrh have come from somewhere else. The Anuad says that they came from the remnants of the 12 worlds. The Elnathay and the Hist are the two types of survivors that narrative gives. Although I'm a little inclined to distrust it, I must admit, because we don't really know what the 12 worlds are, and it also seems to contradict how the basic construction of the world came together. The Anuad has Nirn being made by the previous 12 being smacked together, rather than having the laws of physics set down by the gods who gave themselves up for it, which we have in several narratives from things like Varieties of Faith, the Monomyth, and anything that mentions subgradients. I know there's one or two texts that talk about Anuiel and Sithis as particular instances of subgradients. The Anuad seems to completely ignore that entire process of gods becoming mortals. And I just wanted to clarify something before we go any further. I've been using Myrrh as a general term here, and that's probably not strictly accurate. The Myrrh who most go along with these kinds of narratives are the Altmer, who very explicitly claim descent from the various gods, and to a lesser extent the Bosmer as well, apparently. If we go by Varieties of Faith, we have this quote: "Most Altmeri and Bosmeri claim direct descent from Auriel. In his only known moment of weakness, he agreed to take part in the creation of the mortal plane, that act which forever sundered the elves from the spirit worlds of eternity." So we've got this idea that it's only some of the elves that have this particular attitude. So I'm going to be talking about Myrrhish attitudes in the fairly generic sense of wanting to disregard the world or thinking of the world as something other, well, not necessarily something other than a gift, but not the ultimate goal in some ways. Whereas for men, it's seen as a gift. They were made for the world as part of the world. We see in the Cyrodiilic aspect of the monomyth, thus the Aedra gave free birth to the world, the beasts, and the beings, making these things from parts of themselves. And from the myth of the Arabis, which is connected to the Psychics, the magical beings created the races of the mortal Arabis in their own image, either consciously as artists and craftsmen, or as the fecund rotting matter out of which the mortals sprung forth, or in a variety of other analogical senses. And that myth of Arabis, the Psychic story, was apparently something that was presented to Uriel V early on in his reign by the Psychics, who were trying to explain how Altmeri religion worked. So it's a bit of a halfway house in terms of how it thinks about things. You can see that in the way that it's saying they were created in their own image, or as they're emerging out of the stuff of the divine. So you've got that halfway tension between descent and creation there in that particular narrative. So that's how Man and Myrrh view themselves. If we now look at how they view Mundus and what Mundus is, Myrrh view the world as a bad idea, as a piece of trickery on the part of Lord Khan, which sunders them from what they rightfully deserved as far as they're concerned, which is very similar in some ways to the real world tradition of Gnosticism, whereby the godhead had various emanations, various attributes that started to coalesce and move towards the material world. And the key thing in Gnosticism to link to this is that the Godhead, the Supreme Being, was not what created the world. It was created by one of these emanations and is used as a prison in some forms of Gnosticism for beings of spirit, to keep them imprisoned and to, in some way, enhance the being of the demiurge, to pay worship to the demiurge rather than the true God. This is very, very close to how the general Myrrhish view of Mundus comes across, that they were tricked into giving up their divinity, into becoming the material stuff, which is bad, which corrupts and rots, and is therefore something to be avoided at all costs. Although one potential irony here is that we don't really see the same sort of asceticism that we saw with quite a few Gnostic sects in our own world in Tamriel. The biggest advocates of the idea that Mundus is a bad place that they've been tricked into being brought to and being part of, the Altmer, don't eschew material things. They are striving towards perfection in many ways. They're trying to make good on where they are, which isn't a traditional Gnostic view, at least as far as I'm aware. If you know better than this, please feel free to correct me. So we have this sort of odd contradiction within the Altmerish view that the world is a bad place and needs to be got rid of and shouldn't really have been in the first place, but they're trying to enjoy it while they're still here. At least for most of the Myrrh. The Dunmer and the Chimer before them saw Mundus as a place of challenge, a place of trial, to refine you and to purge you of everything that was wrong with you, and then move you on to something beyond, which adheres very much with the Mannish view that Mundus is a place that you should be thankful that you have. It's an opportunity to exist at all. And if we go by the line from the monomyth, humans, with the exceptions of the Red Guards, see this act as a divine mercy, an enlightenment whereby lesser creatures can reach immortality. Aldmer, with the exception of the Dark Elves, see this act as a cruel deception, a trick that sundered their connections to the spiritual plane, as we discussed before. And I want to go on now and discuss the exception to that, because the Dunmer have a really interesting view on what Mundus is and how it works. There's not so much elaboration on the Mannish view, apart from the fact that the world isn't inherently bad. But we do have one or two examples of that transcendence within Mannish history, most notably Talos Tiber Septim. But there's an awful lot of Dunmer perspective that looks to this kind of transcendence as well. If you look at Sermon 10 in the 36 Lessons of Vivec, Vivec says, "Unto the Hortator, remember the words of Boet Haya. We pledge ourselves to you, the frame maker, the scarab, a world for us to love you in, a cloak of dirt to cherish." That's a reference to Locarn. The idea of a scarab is something that Locarn gets associated with in Dunmerry theology a fair amount, but this is saying, thank you that you've made this world for us. It's not a glamorous place at all. It's called a cloak of dirt, but it's a place that's still worthwhile. And if we look at Boethia's role as specified in the Anticipations, there's a little bit more nuance that can be pulled out here. Boethia was the ancestor who illuminated the elves ages ago before the Mythic era. He told them the truth of Lorkhan's test and defeated Auriel's champion Trinomac. The truth of Lorkhan's test is the key here. Again, and if we want to go that little bit deeper, the Changed Ones gives us some more detail. So one day, Boethia, Prince of Plots, precocious youth, tricked Trinomac to go into his mouth. Boethia talked like Trinomac for a while then, and gathered enough people to listen to him. Boethia showed them the lies of the Etarda, the Aedra, and told them that Trinomac was the biggest liar of all, saying all this with Trinomac's voice. Boethia told the mass before him the triangled truth. He showed them, with Mephala, the rules of the Psychic Endeavour. And the Psychic Endeavour, as we can find out elsewhere, is the idea of transcending mortal boundaries, of moving beyond, returning to the first brush of Anu Padme and all that good stuff. Boethia's philosophy here is pushing the idea that it's a place to go to understand that you have to be tried, that you have to be pushed, and that you have to then move beyond, which is fundamentally different to the way that the Altmer view things. They're very, very keen to go back to the way things were before, whereas the Dunmer are looking forward to move beyond, to keep on trucking until they can transcend in whatever way, shape, or form. And from what we can tell, that sort of perspective is what man want as well. The big exception to that is the Red Guards, who are a race of men who consider, very much like the Myrrh, that they have been tricked into being on the mortal plane. They are, at the same time, striving to go back to the far shores by whatever means necessary, by walking at strange angles, by going on the walkabout, by accepting the help of whatever gods they can, to return to their place beyond the stars. And that's again a going back to, which is contra to the typical view of man, as it were. And because they're traveling in different directions, and you've got that relation of what was before and what is to come as a different perspective on how man and Myrrh see the world, that affects their view on godhood. The Altmer particularly consider godhood a natural right. The very word Aedra means our ancestors. So you're thinking, this is what we've come from, this is what we can be again. And the Dunmer have their own particular spin on this, but it's still quite a Myrrhish view for the Dunmer, to be fair, that there's no real objection to the tribunal as mortal gods. There's a very ready acceptance that you can have Myrrh who are gods. There's also a line that MK posted in the Red Guard Forum Madness in 1999 that ran contrary to the usual translation of Aedra being ancestors and Daedra being not our ancestors. There was the idea that the Dunmer in particular consider the Daedra our stronger, better ancestors. This still has the idea of descent from the gods and therefore being able to be gods again, but it's from a different source, it's from a different group of ancestor spirits. And the Psychics, in their founding, kind of took a stand against the preeminence of what's now the Aedra as well. They tried to revere Aedra and Daedra as ancestors of equal standing. But the Dunmer in particular have taken the view that Daedra are their ancestors as well, and there's this potentially different meaning to the word. We have the book The Old Ways, which puts the Psychic view quite interestingly. What, after all, is the origin of these spiritual forces that move the invisible strings of Mundus? Any neophyte of Artaeum knows that these spirits are our ancestors, and that, while living, they too were bewildered by the spirits of their ancestors, and so on back to the original Acarii. The Daedra and gods to whom the common people turn are no more than the spirits of superior men and women whose power and passion granted them great influence in the afterworld. I would take the term men and women advisedly here, simply to be referring to genders, particularly as they're talking about the Acarii or Acharii, or however you pronounce it, because the Psychics were founded by Altmer, who didn't like the way that Somerset was turning. So I don't see that they'd be talking about man as the mannish races. They were talking about men and women as people as such. But that notion that the Aedra and Daedra are not a distinct set of groups, and they are just from where everyone came, is a pretty unique standpoint for either Man or Myrrh in the Elder Scrolls. Both of these viewpoints, as much as they're different to the standard Altmeri Bosmeri view, are also in quite stark contrast to the view of men. They generally see godhood as a thing to be accomplished and fought for, something that is earned, something that is awarded. Tiber Septim is celebrated for achieving godhood, being awarded it by the gods and rising up to become one of them, rather than just reclaiming what was his all along. And this, I think, is why the Thalmor in particular dislike the notion of men becoming gods. They're changing existential categories in a way that Myrrh aren't if men become gods. If a Myrrh becomes a god, that's just right and proper. They're just reclaiming their birthright and having what's theirs all over again. If a man becomes a god, that's something changing to join us. That's them becoming us in a way. It's an outsider and another category of being altogether becoming something that they really shouldn't be, as far as the Myrrh are concerned. And that idea of different sources is also something that plays into more than just the ancestry debate between Man and Myrrh. It also plays into where they came from. We have various accounts saying that Myrrh came from Aldmeris and men came from Atmora. Atmora being a big frozen continent to the north of Tamriel, and Aldmeris being a nice, temperate, paradisical world to the south. But there are some little hints here and there that make the relationship between Aldmeris and Atmora kind of interesting. There's the idea that they could potentially be the same place. There's the idea of Aldmeris being a distinct land or from Tamriel and to the south of Tamriel in the 3rd edition pocket guide and elsewhere, although it's again somewhere that the elves never found. They looked for a place called Aldmeris or Old Elnafay, but no one has ever found it. If you look at some little snippets of text from some places, most notably for me, Varieties of Faith, it considers them to be the same place. If you look at the description of Orki in Varieties of Faith, it describes him as a lone god of the Nords who seemed to have taken up his worship during Aldmeri rule of Atmora. And there's accounts also in the monomyth that talks about Auriel losing Atmora to the men. So Myrrh were present in Atmora during the Mythic era, that during the Dawn era. So what does that mean for its relation to Aldmeris? That's raised all sorts of questions in the community, and there are quite a few possibilities that have come out of this. There's the idea that Aldmeris could just be an idea. It's the idea of a unified elven people, and that the people of Old Elnafay, whatever it may be, should be one thing, and it's a perfect place. There are various little clues in the various texts here. When you look at the 36 Lessons of Vivec, when Vivec and Nerevar travel across all of Nirn, they don't go south. And when Nerevar asks Vivec what's down there, Vivec is silent on the matter. He never says where Aldmeris should be. And Topal the Explorer never finds Aldmeris, despite setting off and travelling everywhere from the Somerset Isles. They honestly don't find it. The Anuad has a really interesting idea that Aldmeris is Tamriel. We have the quote of, "The old Elnafay realm, though ruined, became Tamriel. The remnants of the Wanderers were left divided on the other 3 continents, which in this case are Atmora, Yokuda, and Akavir." So there's the idea of, is Aldmeris simply the idea of unified elven rule somewhere? Is it an actual place? Is it the racial purity of the elves, maybe? There's all sorts of little spins on it, and in the most bald place where it comes across as being an idea is in the Numantia Intercept, which says, this sundering of purpose is the myth of the destruction of Aldmeris. Outside of the dawn, and even then only in the dreamtime of its landscape, there was never a terrestrial homeland of the elves. Old Elnathay is a magical ideal of mixed memories of the dawn. Do not believe the written histories. All mortal life started on the starry heart of dawn's beauty Tamriel. Now, there is a caveat that's got to be added in here, that's something that Kirkbride wrote after he left being an employee of Bethesda. He's still been writing an awful lot of material for them as an independent contractor since then, but the text of the Intercept itself is a little questionable if you're fussed about canonicity. I still think it's a really cool idea. We've also got Lawrence Schick remarking somewhere, I can't find it yet, if I do, it will be in the blog post, that Aldmeris is a place, or at least as far as he's concerned. But there's still that idea of Aldmeris being an idea as to why they can't find it. And that idea of descent, of purity, of oneness is the thing that kind of binds the elves together, is one of the things that makes them elves in a lot of the way. Elder Scrolls Online Somerset does, however, posit the idea that Aldmeris is something like an idea and not really a reality as such. We've got the text, the ubiquitous sinking isle, which goes through Yokuda, Thras, and Aldmeris, and expresses them in terms of being a mythical thing, something that's constructed by each race as a past to be. To quote from it, each island, that is Yokuda, Thras, and Aldmeris, was the ancestral home of its resident race, and in all three cases, foes or fate destroyed the island as punishment for some act of hubris. In the case of the Red Guards, foolish sword singers sundered the Yokudan Isles with a forbidden sword stroke. The warriors of the All-Flags Navy drove the Slode and their island of Thras into the sea as punishment for the Thracian plague, and our forebears, the Aldmer, fled the Isles of Aldmeris to avoid some mysterious calamity, likely the result of our fall from Adric grace. Now, a novice historian would likely take these tales at face value. If multiple histories say the island sank, it must have sunk. But I entreat you to look deeper. Could it be that the sinking island is not a literal event, but rather a metaphorical one? Thras, Yokuda, and Aldmeris are much more than simple landmasses. They are societal symbols, avatars of a cultural identity lost in time. So stories about the sundering or sinking of these islands may be a trick of the light, a poet's attempt at explaining the pain of forgotten origins. Did an entire continent drown as the result of a sword stroke? Did our ancestors travel to Somerset from a mythical half-Adric isle? I think not. These lost islands rest at the fault line between fact and parable. There is truth in these tales, certainly, but the true historian knows that not all truth is literal. Now, that almost seems to back up the Intercept account that Aldmeris is a metaphor. However, it kind of lumps Yokuda and Thras all together with it. So I'm a little inclined to be skeptical about its entirety of the event. But it is right in thinking that Aldmeris is primarily a symbol of the singular identity of the elves. If you think about how the Crystal Tower is constructed, it's more or less a memorial to the Aldmer. It's even got the graves of the first Aldmeri settlers within it. There's a notion that Somerset and the Crystal Tower and so on is a memorial to something else, to some past shared identity. And the mourning of that loss could potentially be just the sundering of Aldmeris, the separation of the Myrrhish races into different strands. But what about Atmora at this point? Atmora is, in theory, the place where men came from, but that's questionable as well. The orthodox idea of where men came from is that they all came out of Atmora, and that the Nords of Skyrim are the first men, they're the proto-men, and however you want to put it. But we have various other things that point to this not necessarily being the case as well. The text Frontier, Conquest and Accommodation, A Social History of Cyrodiil, talks about how historians often portray the human settlement of Tamriel as a straightforward process of military expansion of the Nords of Skyrim. In fact, human settlers occupied nearly every corner of Tamriel before Skyrim was even founded. These so-called Nedic peoples include the Proto-Cyrodiilians, the ancestors of the Bretons, the Aboriginals of Hammerfell, and perhaps the now vanished human population of Morrowind. Strictly speaking, the Nords are simply another of these Nedic peoples, the only one that failed to find a method of peaceful accommodation with the elves who already occupied Tamriel. Ysgramor was certainly not the first human settler in Tamriel. In fact, in fleeing civil war in Atmora, as the Song of Return states, Ysgramor was following a long tradition of migration from Atmora. Tamriel had served as a safety valve for Atmora for centuries before Ysgramor's arrival. Malcontents, dissidents, rebels, landless younger sons all made the difficult crossing from Atmora to the new world of Tamriel. New archaeological excavations date the earliest human settlements in Hammerfell, High Rock, and Cyrodiil at the years 800 to 1000 Merithic era, centuries earlier than Ysgramor, even assuming that the 12 Nord kings prior to Harald were actual historical figures. So we have this idea that humans may have come from Atmora. We've also got a comment from Kurt Kuhlman that was made in character generally. It's not really clear from the source that we've got whether this particular line is in character or not, but it calls the origin of the Needs the usual imperial arrogance. The hoary old out of Atmora theory has been widely discredited. No reputable archaeologist would publicly support it these days, but the imperial geographers continue to beat the drum of the Nordic fatherland in the best tradition of the Septim Empire. So we've also got that dispute in terms of where men come from as well. You've got some saying they come from Atmora. You've got the account in the Anuad saying that they were scattered across all of the other continents. You've also got the idea that everything started in Tamriel, so men also started in Tamriel. It's quite messy in terms of where they possibly come from. And there's no concrete answer to that I'm aware of at this stage. But it's just that the idea of a unified mannish expansion with the Nords of Skyrim as the proto-men, as the most mannish of men, is probably bunk. That the various races of men have come and spread out from Tamriel, either from Atmora or from where they were originally created or descended from the gods, whichever way you want to spin it, and spread throughout Tamriel that way. The Anuad has it rather interestingly that they were scattered everywhere and have steadily gravitated back towards Tamriel. You've had the ones from Yokuda, the ones from Atmora, and the ones from Akavir that were all scattered and displaced from the ruin of the 12 worlds. And you've also got an idea that the fan communities have come up with, and Michael Kirkbride has vaguely supported, that the idea of Atmora being something else and consequently Aldmeris being something else, they almost seem in these sorts of theories to be mirror images of each other. There's the idea of Atmora being a frozen place. In the 36 Lessons, it's described as a place of frozen bearded kings, and even the accounts in the Pocket Guide to the Empire say that the place is cooling, it's becoming inhospitable because there's so much cold and ice and everything else that everyone was steadily fleeing Atmora to Tamriel. There's various theories that have pulled this together as saying it's becoming frozen, but is it becoming frozen because it's cold or because there's no time there anymore? It's an interesting little leap. I really like the conceptual idea of it, of Atmora being a space that's simply run out of time and everything that implies. Aldmeris, in this sort of theory, has been pitched as being time without space, which makes sense if Aldmeris is an idea. It's simply something that exists in the mind. It doesn't have any physical representation, ergo, no space. It's a really, really appealing symmetry, but there's not an awful lot to back this specific interpretation. I like it a lot. I think that you can spin certain texts to suggest that it is the case, but it's not got a lot of explicit evidence for it in this particular case. And I'd just like to kind of start to segue into the question of whether the Thalmor want to destroy or unmake Mundus, which has become a fairly common idea that gets bounced around, by riffing on that idea of Aldmeris being an idea that goes on and gets changed. If we think about the way that political movements in general, ideological movements in general, tend to treat the past, it's generally through very rose-tinted glasses. That you look at movements like the Nazis, to go for the obvious comparator to Thalmor, but also modern Islamist movements, they do very, very similar things to the past in how they conceptualize it. These sorts of groups look back to an ideal that there's this perfect German pastoral family and existence of strong Aryan people, in the same way that there's one unified Islamic Ummah, or Ummah according to the jihadists, who are striving to try and create that thing by force and recreate a perfect idea of their ideal state. In both cases, you've got very, very idealistic people trying to recreate a past that was very probably imaginary, which is an interesting little parallel to look at in terms of what the Thalmor are trying to do in the Fourth Era. They are looking at the past and saying the elves should be dominant over Tamriel and maybe other things as well, which I'll get to in a second. And in so doing, going along with the idea of Aldmeris, I can't find where it is, but I'm sure I remember reading somewhere that there's a text that references the idea of Aldmeris as a unified elvish existence and homeland is a thing that's come up every so often throughout Tamriel's history as a reason for conquest, as a reason for the elves to expand and unify and crush all before them. But to the explicit idea of Thalmor wanting to unmake Mundus, this idea comes from a forum post which Michael Kirkbride made some years ago that is entitled An Altmeri Commentary on Talos. It goes, "To kill man is to reach heaven, from where we came before the doom drum's iniquity. When we accomplish this, we can escape the mockery and long shame of the material prison. To achieve this goal, we must 1. Erase the upstart Talos from the mythic. His presence fortifies the wheel of the convention and binds our souls to this plane. 2. Remove man not just from the world, but from the pattern of possibility, so that the very idea of them can be forgotten and thereby never again repeated. 3. With Talos and the sons of Talos removed, the dragon will become ours to unbind. The world of mortals will be over. The dragon will uncoil his hold on the stagnancy of linear time and move as free serpent again, moving through the ether without measure or burden, spilling time along the innumerable roads we once travelled, and with that we will regain the mantle of the imperishable spirit." Now, there's an awful lot here which chimes with what we were talking earlier about Gnosticism, the idea of the material world being a prison for beings of pure spirit who are being kept in the material world against their will by a malevolent creator. But their focus on Talos is kind of interesting, because it's looking at Talos as the thing that's fortifying the wheel of convention, which I'll get to in a second. But first I want to address why I think this isn't necessarily an indication that the Thalmor want to destroy the world. Firstly, it's pitched as an Atmora commentary on Talos. It's not a Thalmor commentary. It's not attached to anyone within the administration of the Atmora Dominion. So it's entirely possible, from my perspective, that this particular text is some xenophobic or hermit, mystic, whatever, Altmer, who is locked up in his tower, creating crackpot ideas, and that this has been found by someone and taken on as something. It could be that. It could very well be the goal of the Thalmor, but we have no real indication of that from the text. And it also runs counter to the suggestion of the Thalmor goals as was stated in the Infernal City. I talk about that particular one in last time's cast when I talk about the towers, but the takeaway here is that the Thalmor are trying to establish a new Myrrhic era, is roughly the words that get used. It also misspells it horribly, which I can't stand. But it's the idea of establishing Elven dominion over Tamriel. It's not necessarily to wipe the world out. And there's also other little nuggets here which I want to dig into a little. If we're thinking about this as the goal of the Atmora Dominion, then why does Talos even matter? Why is he fortifying the wheel of convention? Talos was man-made god. He was not at convention itself. This is mostly taking from some conversations that happened around Talos as Convention 2.0, achieved through mantling Lorcan. I'll link a post that goes into this in quite some detail from the TES Law subreddit by Lilris. The key part of it is that if we assume that the Arcturian heresy is true, then Tiber Septim recreates convention in everything that happens around the creation of the Mantella. Someone gets their heart ripped out, there is betrayal, there is a new world and new gods being created, and so on and so forth. Within that, we have a mini convention, and everyone who's involved in that gets sucked into the Talos Oversoul. So Talos is not one but three, which I will go into in more detail in a future cast. But in that reenactment of the convention, he contains within himself all the aspects of convention, and as such acts as a reiteration of convention and all that it means. The general consensus as to how Talos, as to how Tiber Septim, Hjalti Earlybeard, Zurian Arctus, Wulfarth, Izmir Wulfarth, and all the rest of it, achieved divinity is through mantling Lorcan, through imitating Lorcan. I will try not to go into any more detail because it really deserves its own cast. But from that kind of idea, he's got all of the pieces of convention and can therefore replace it in a way, can step into the missing god's place and reinforce the idea of the material world as something that is created, that is strived for, that is an idea. You also have, in the more idealistic portrayals of Tiber Septim, his dream of a unified Tamriel and such like. And so that's why we can see Talos being Convention 2.0 and reinstating the general mannish view that the material world is a good thing. It needs to hang around for as many people to try and achieve divinity or happiness or whatever in the time that it's around, contrary to the Myrrhish view that it shouldn't exist, that it's a bad idea, and that it potentially, that it needs to be got rid of. The idea of the Thalmor trying to destroy the world doesn't necessarily have that much credence, but it certainly fits very well with what we understand as the general Myrrhish perspective on the material world and their relation to it. And that's about it for this cast. If you've enjoyed this, please like and subscribe on your favourite podcast catcher and join the conversation at the Written in Uncertainty Discord. Drop in and send me a message on writteninuncertainty.wordpress.com and join us next time. We've talked a lot in this episode about the structure of the world in the Elder Scrolls, how it may have been cobbled together, and in the last part about the Wheel of Convention, and the time before last we talked about the wheel itself. There was some talk in that last quote about unbinding the dragon. Unbinding the dragon is actually something that's happened quite a few times within Tamriel's history, with huge amounts of consequences that have shaken up the world. Join us next week when we ask, how do dragon breaks work? Until then, this podcast remains a letter written in uncertainty. You've been listening to Written in Uncertainty, an Elder Scrolls podcast written and presented by Aramithius, with some kind editorial help from Cyphery and Thalmor Justicar. The music for this podcast has been kindly provided by Jan Glembotsky. Check them out on SoundCloud under Songs from the Lost Land, and I'll see you next time.